I'm Robina Xavier. I'm the president of the Queensland Academy of Arts and Sciences, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to our webinar on trade in the Trumpian world, a joint collaboration between the Centre for Data Science at QUT and the Academy, and we're really pleased to be able to bring you the session today. In starting today, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from where we're broadcasting, the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay respect to elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits. I also acknowledge that a number of our panellists and participants are located in different parts of Australia and recognise all of the traditional owners in those areas. We have a wonderful panel today to take us through the broad topic that we're going to look at from both an economic, geopolitical and cultural perspective. Professors John Quiggin, Karen Hussey and Mark Ryan, well known to many who'll be on the call today and also experts in their field. So I'm going to ask John to start us off today. As many of you know, John's a Professor of Economics at the University of Queensland, a very prominent research economist and commentator on Australian and international economic policy. And we frequently see John in all different channels commenting on really important topics for all of us. So I'm going to ask now John to start us off.
Thanks very much, Robina. Yeah, I'd like to acknowledge the Cubby Cubby people from whose land I'm broadcasting here on the Sunshine Coast at the moment, and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So the title is Trumpian World, but as with lots of things to do with Donald Trump, these things didn't drop out of the sky at the last election or even in 2016 when Trump was first elected as US president. Rather, we're seeing the culmination so far of a trajectory which we can trace back to really the mid-1990s. This was the high point of the so-called rules-based economic order centred on the World Trade Organization, which at its peak aspired to write the constitution of a new global economy. I think it's fair to say, looking at the WTO today, it certainly isn't doing much in the way of writing constitutions or guiding the global economy. So what happened over this process and why, how did we get to where we stand and where we like to go in the future in these terms? Well, as that statement indicated, the WTO in its heyday was prone to overreach. And what we saw was a bunch of decisions made by the WTO which rapidly lined up significant groups in a position of hostility. In particular, striking down a range of environmental protections on the grounds, allegedly, that they unfairly burden trade, even though in many cases there was no obvious discrimination between domestic and domestic producers and foreign producers. The US, for example, required that fishing traps should include a turtle excluded device to save endangered turtles. The WTO said, no, that's too much. We don't want that. A bunch of decisions of that kind, as well as extensions of the notion of trade agreements way beyond the notion of if I import goods into your country, I don't have to pay a tariff. Perhaps the biggest were investor-state dispute settlement, which essentially said a foreign investor could take a government to court but not to court, to arbitration, to arbitrators essentially selected to be favourable to investors if they felt that policy decisions of that government unfairly burdened them. And we saw that, for example, used by Philip Morris against the Australian government in an attempt to stop the imposition of plain or rather nastily unattractive labels on tobacco. They lost, but of course saying, oh, that came out okay because the complainant lost is not much of a comfort, especially if you're a poor country in Africa, for example, trying to do something about public health. The idea that you might beat Philip Morris in the end is not very appealing. So these kinds of things, and the other important one is so-called TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property. So this in many ways actually speaks to a divide within the supporters of free trade that the advocates of this wanted stronger patent protection. Now, patents are a restriction on trade. They say even though I could make shall we say, an anti-AIDS drug and sell it much more cheaply than the company that developed it. I can't do that because they have a patent. The attempt of this legislation was to impose these kinds of restrictions, not only within the country that granted the patent, but in some sense globally. So we've seen, first, for example, if you go back far enough, the so-called Battle of Seattle, essentially a demonstration turning into a riot against the World Trade Organization in, I think, 1997. That was part of a long push back against the kinds of expansive notions of trade agreements that characterise the WTO. If we skip on, though, through this process, we saw steady pushback, particularly against investor-state dispute settlement. Investor-state dispute settlement, pushing on to 2016 when Donald Trump was elected, very strongly against this, since it was an infringement of national sovereignty, but also against the US being held to account in any kind of international proceeding whatsoever. What Trump did was to refuse to approve the appointment of any more judges to the WTO's World Trade Organization's Disputes Resolution Tribunal, which rapidly fell short of a quorum. That's a fairly typical Trumpian move. But what's important is that when Trump went out and Biden came in, the US continued exactly that same policy. So far from this being a particular frolic of Trump's, as some of the things he did were, this represented a substantial and fundamental shift in US policy away from the notion of a rules-based global world with arbiters who in some sense were supposed to be independent, and towards a view that that trade was too important to be left to trade deals and international tribunals, particularly in the context of competition with China. And of course, this wasn't only happening in the US. As we'll recall, during the COVID pandemic, for whatever reason, our Prime Minister decided it was really important that China should be investigated as to where the source of the pandemic was. Unsurprisingly, the Chinese government wasn't very happy about this, and without actually declaring it, it suddenly became impossible to sell a wide range of products into China. That, of course, is not by any means China's only intervention of this kind. Repeatedly, when governments have annoyed the Chinese government in some way, the government of Lithuania said something nice to Taiwan and was blocked from various markets for a while. The Chinese government, again, has the view that rules might be okay for unimportant countries. They certainly aren't going to apply to China. Now, this has been developing for quite a while, and what we've seen is a bunch of multilateral and plurilateral agreements developing around the failure of the WTO, but these agreements themselves have typically started to exclude a lot more of the strong agenda of the WTO. So the biggest one is the TPPA trend. I haven't got my acronyms right, but essentially it started out again as a kind of geopolitical fence created by the Obama administration in an attempt to create something that excluded China, but ended up with the US out of it, but a whole bunch of Pacific nations in. And I suppose an illustration of the general process again is Brexit. So Britain ends up in this Trans-Pacific Agreement, but not in the common market of Europe, which again reflects very misguided in my view, but very increasing sentiment that people don't want to be in these kinds of very tight agreements where they're subject to a whole range of controls as to what they can, what rules they can impose, scaling back to much more minimal things of we won't tariff you and you won't tariff us. So as of late 2020, that part of the story is still held. We hadn't seen any significant resurgence of tariffs anywhere. Even in the first Trump, we had some in the first Trump administration, some of which were maintained by Biden, but these were relatively limited. It's only in this second term of Trump that we've seen a huge expansion in the use of tariffs, and in a largely capricious kind of way. And this, I guess, reflects Trump's own character and his general view of tariffs, not as an instrument of a well-thought-out industrial policy in which we're going to look and say, these are the areas we want to build up, and with a recognition, really, here we can thank, although the general point has always been well known, Max Corden, one of the leading Australian trade economists, developed the idea of effective protection. So what he says is, look, you might have a tariff protecting you against imports, but if the inputs to your production are heavily tariffed, you end up with negative effective protection. And particularly in most contexts, but if you're an agricultural exporter, then farmers end up with negative effective protection, and that's been the case. That's been the case very much for the US. In lots of areas that the farmers have lost out. So we see in any case that although every now and then we get a new tariff, and this appears likely to continue at least as long as Trump remains in office. So we had the first big set of tariffs, so-called Liberation Day in April. Some of them were scaled back. Essentially, roughly speaking, the story was Trump came to visit. You flattered him outrageously, made a promise that hundreds of billions of dollars would be sent to the US with a tidy rake off for Trump personally, and then mostly just went back to really doing whatever it was you were going to do in the first place. And I remember somebody making this point as a general piece of advice in negotiations of various kinds, just agree to what the other side says and then do whatever you're going to do anyway, and it goes away fairly smoothly. So we're seeing this kind of process playing out. Meanwhile, countries that are significantly affected are trying to reroute their agreements, essentially definitely around the US, but also in parallel to some extent around China. So we're seeing a world economy and a way of thinking about the world very much premised on, well, the big dogs are the US and China, they're the ones that matter, to a world in which really people are looking at these things and saying the US is important, but it's not really a big trading nation. It's a largely self-sufficient country, so even though it accounts for something like 20% of world GDP, that's only 12% of world trade. Unless you're Canada or Mexico, the answer is probably best just to scale back your reliance on the US market gradually and look for other markets. China, much more a trading country, of course, but again, now being seen as not the most reliable trading partner. We're seeing big efforts to replicate production in areas where China has naturally been dominant. So China has huge dominance, for example, in all aspects of renewable energy, but we're seeing India, Europe, other places trying to build up their own capacity as hard as they can, even though in a rules-based world it would be much cheaper just to take the Chinese product. They don't want to be in the situation of China suddenly saying, oh, look, you've annoyed us over here and we're going to cut off your solar panels. So this kind of development is taking place, and in my view is broadly speaking likely to continue after, should Trump leave office in 2028, which remains to be seen. I doubt that we're going to see anything like a return to the pre-2016 status quo. We're going to see, I think, these developments continuing, and then that has a bunch of implications for countries like Australia that aren't, and groups like the TPP, which are still standing outside this process, where we're going to go. So I'll leave it there and move on to Karen, I guess. Thank you.
Thanks, John, and I'm sure there's lots of questions that will come from that. So we are going to bridge now into the energy and environmental aspects as well with Professor Karen Hussey, who's the full-time chair of the Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee and an honorary professor at the Centre for Policy Futures at UQ. And Karen was previously the Deputy Director General of the Queensland Government Department of Environment and Science. So we're really happy that you could join us today, Karen. Thank you.
Thanks, Robina, and thanks, John. That was a very nice segue to my comments. And hello, everyone who's online now and possibly listening to this after the fact. So I thought I'd touch on 4 shifts that we can see have occurred over the last 12 months under the Trump administration, which have direct or indirect consequences for the climate, energy, environment policy domains. The first, picking up on John's commentary, is very much in relation to the tariff protocols that are in place now. The second is in relation to the Trump administration's undermining of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. The third is in relation to the Trump's administration's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. And then the fourth relates to the rolling back of some fairly significant environmental legislation. So I'll go through each of those 4 with respect to what I think it means for sort of climate change, but also Australia, and then follow it up at the end just with some broader comments around where I think we're heading. So to pick up on John's points, the sort of uncertainty and mayhem and confusion caused by the increase in tariffs earlier on in the year, and then backflipping on some of them and then adding some others, and all of that clearly just serves to sort of add considerable uncertainty and investor wariness, I guess you could say, none of which will surprise you. In terms of the direct implications for Australia as it relates to energy and climate and the environment, they're relatively modest. So the commodities that had their tariffs increase that would immediately speak to, say, high carbon commodities would be steel and aluminium, and to some extent beef, all of which had their tariffs doubled in some cases, and then pulled back in terms of beef. But what we saw was the Trump administration, as John said, come in and say, we're going to make more money out of this. We're not happy with the trade imbalance, so we're going to whack higher tariffs on some of those key commodities. Australia was relatively protected from those tariff increases, not entirely, but the United States has not been a major exporter for us for steel and aluminium when you compare it to some of our other export markets, principally China. Beef is another matter, though. We do export quite considerable quantities of beef to the US, and there were some sort of frantic negotiations behind the scenes over the last 6 months to try to ease some of that. Someone from the beef industry was telling me the other day that it's something like 1,000 Australian beef patties are eaten in the US every day. So that clearly mattered. But with respect to those that are specifically related to sort of the energy transition and our desire collectively, I think, although perhaps now absent the US, to move towards net zero by 2050, the major pieces there or implications there are via China. Right. So clearly the tariff increases had a huge impact on China. China is our largest exporting economy. And so the implications are as a consequence of what it does to demand and supply in the Chinese market. There are a couple of interesting elements, and John touched on this around the US and Trump wanting greater sovereignty in terms of domestic production. And so you saw the recent negotiation between the US and the Australian government in relation to rare earths. That's a tricky one for Australia in some respects. We are blessed with, in fact, they're not rare, they're abundant. They're just really difficult to get to. The US, the Chinese rather, have the sort of 80% approximately of global supply. And we have a really good chunk of it too. We now have a dedicated relationship with the US to be able to deliver it to them. It's interesting when you see the rhetoric around that deal from the US. It's all about rare earth being needed for defense and other advanced technologies rather than anything related to the net zero transition. So that's the sort of the increased tariffs piece is complicated and shouldn't be considered in a bilateral US-Australia sense. It absolutely needs to be done in that broader context, including but not limited to our trade relationship with China. The second, I would argue, frankly, more important implication from a climate and an energy perspective was Trump's fairly immediate undermining of the Inflation Reduction Act, which, of course, the Biden administration had brought in. This was an enormous commitment of funding for clean energy generation, clean energy manufacturing, subsidization of households to shift to renewable energy, et cetera, et cetera. So it was very much about providing economic stimulus for the economy more broadly, but very much directed towards renewable energy and the transition to zero net emissions. And we mirrored that with our own legislation in terms of the Future Made in Australia piece. So what's happened is that essentially there has been a significant freeze imposed by the Trump administration on the IRA, and so a lot of that funding is now tied up in court battles to try and get it unfrozen, so that those investments can continue to be made. We've seen a lot of staff laid off, and it's provided considerable uncertainty, at least in the American context, about where they're going vis-a-vis renewable energy. However, I would say there are two qualifying factors here that we need to be mindful of. The first is that where there's a vacuum, other actors will try to fill it. And certainly, I think the Australian government and others have seen an opportunity for Australia to crowd in the investment that would otherwise have gone into the US to come into Australia. And the addition of $2 billion to the Clean Energy Finance Corporation's budget a few months ago, February, I think it was, it is an example of that. So where the US departs stage left, here we go. Australia is a small, exporting, stable democracy with a very educated population, high costs in labour, but you step in with some subsidies and we start to look very attractive as a foreign direct investment play. The second, in relation to the IRA, is Trump can certainly freeze funding programs, but he can't dictate what producers buy in terms of their energy. And as you can say, drill, baby, drill. You can promote coal. You can take money away from renewable energy, but the economics, as John will say, I'm sure, or I hope, of renewable energy are such that producers are still going to want to buy renewable energy. Right, they're still going to move in that direction because it's cheaper, and that's that's not ideological. That's just simply how can we make more money faster, which you would think Trump would be after. But anyway, the third is withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement. I think when it happened, there was a lot of angst and concern about what this would mean, loss of momentum. The United States is clearly an enormous player in all multilateral fora, but certainly in the Paris Agreement, they've been pivotal over the last 10 years. In truth, the rest of the world kind of said, we're going to carry on. Right? They're just getting on with it. In the COP last week in Brazil, or the last few weeks in Brazil, the US didn't send a delegation, very much made it clear that they weren't going to have anything to do with the Paris Agreement, with the UNFCCC, etc. But we still saw it go ahead. We still saw some progress, perhaps not as much as we would all have liked to have seen, but certainly in my circles, and if you see Australia's contribution to that and desire to very much lead the negotiations going into next year's COP. The absence of the US is being felt, but is not the end of the world, because I think an awful lot of countries can see the benefits of carrying on. That is not to say that there hasn't been a change in some quarters around, trying to dampen aspirations and ambition around climate change. I'd be interested in John's views on this, but there were some comments from Bill Gates a few months ago which sort of seemed to say it's not all that bad. We don't need to put all our eggs into the mitigation basket. We'd be better off trying to adapt. Obviously, our own political landscape is one half are eating their young, trying to figure out what to do with net zero. But in the main, momentum is there, it's been maintained, and the rest of the world is carrying on in the absence of the US playing any kind of leadership role. And the fourth and final piece I wanted to speak to was just around the rolling back of environmental legislation. That's been progressively sort of increasing in significance over the last 10 months or so. We've seen the EPA no longer able to consider greenhouse gas emissions as a material harm to human health. We've seen recently rolling back legislation in relation to wetlands, endangered species, the Clean Water Act, etc. So we're talking about a country that really led the way from the 70s onwards in terms of federal legislation for significant environmental issues. Have that very much whittled away in the last year. What does that mean? Well, it's desperately sad for the environmental assets in the US, naturally. But if you consider that there are a whole load of sort of policy settings and architecture in place in the broader sort of global scene across supply chains, like commitments to climate-related financial disclosure, like commitments to nature-related financial disclosures, like the introduction of carbon border adjustments in the EU. There's enough architecture there at the moment, I think, one, to encourage business to stay the course on their climate, energy, and environmental credentials, but two, potentially also to offer an opportunity for countries like Australia. We are blessed with extraordinary resources in terms of renewable energy resources, but also our natural assets. Our carbon sequestration potential is immense because of the size of our landscapes. If that private sector demand for cleaner supply chains carries on, then Australia is really uniquely placed to be the one that delivers the commodities that are green, right? And so again, if you've got the US backing away and no longer able to do that because they don't have the credentials anymore, then arguably those countries that are prepared to lean further in will benefit from that vacuum. And then just finally, I think John touched on this to some extent, or to a great extent, in terms of the multilateral system of trade has really experienced 20 years of disaggregation away from multilateralism to bilateral free trade agreements and the like. For Australia, at least in the climate, energy, environment space, we are continuing to progress discussions, most recently with the EU-Australia free trade agreement around renewable energy. Around non-tariff barriers as they relate to environmental goods and services in a way that is inherently positive. So, to some extent, I kind of go, well, the Americans are significant. Obviously, we'd love it to be any other way than it is at the moment in terms of leadership. But we're all getting on with the job, Robina. I think that is the summary. We are just getting on with the job because it is so important that we do.
Great, thank you. A very Australian way of going forward, isn't it? And as we started today, as the Queensland Academy of Arts and Sciences, we always try and ensure that we have a mix across our speakers covering all of the different frames within arts and sciences, which is quite broad. So I'm delighted today that we have Professor Mark Ryan join us, who's a professor in screen and media studies for the School of Creative Arts and a chief investigator for the Digital Media Research Centre. Mark writes extensively on cinema and the television industry. So we're going to cross now to Mark to look at the cultural impacts of the tariffs as well. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much. So today, in terms of cultural trade, I'll be talking about film and television production, and particularly because Trump has recently reiterated that he will be putting 100% tariffs on movies, and it's very unclear exactly what he's talking about, but I will get into that. I'm just going to start off with a little bit about how film and TV is kind of a global system at the moment. And so putting tariffs on American movies made overseas or movies flowing into America is very problematic for a number of reasons. So often when we talk about global film and TV production, we do think about Hollywood and this idea of global Hollywood. And of course, Hollywood has been making a large proportion of its films overseas for quite a period of time. And of course, the design center or Hollywood itself remains centered in Los Angeles, but they outsource all sorts of the production processes and even the post-production processes to other countries around the world. And to a large extent, that is because governments offer incentives around the world, and they're looking for the best deal to kind of lower the cost of production. But in many cases, this has been happening for such a long period of time now. It is kind of just the way things are done, and there's lots of partnerships with overseas, companies and studios, and so Hollywood does outsource production all around the world. But it's not just Hollywood. The major streamers from Netflix, Prime, all of the major kind of enterprises kind of making film and TV programs do to some extent participate in this kind of global system of production where they might shoot part of the film in Australia, they might shoot the other part in Mexico or Canada. The post-production might go to Germany or China, and obviously it's all assembled, and a lot of that is being led from the headquarters of the company, in many cases in the United States. And then, the film is assembled and then released globally all around the world. But a lot of the inputs into the production, so going back to what John was talking about, are kind of globally sourced. And it's not just kind of Hollywood blockbusters or major projects of the streamers. A lot of independent production is becoming increasingly global as well. And independent producers are looking towards co-production, working with partners in other countries around the world. And in many cases, often this type of production is criticized for seeking incentives from various countries to lower the cost of production. But in many cases, this is a strategic partnership decision as well by studios and streamers to kind of gain access to markets and to increase the scale of production and access to finances. So when Trump's original announcement was kind of released on Truth Social, it really did kind of send massive shockwaves through the industry, and lots of commentators and studios and filmmakers. Everyone was kind of rushing to kind of work out exactly what the announcement meant, particularly because there hasn't been a lot of detail around what he actually wants to do. And the statement was, 100% tariff on any and all movies coming into our country that are produced in foreign lands. And so, of course, thinking about it through the lens of America first, people are kind of interpreting that as Donald Trump wants all, US production to be made in America. But it is also very vague, that statement. First of all, I'll just point out that 100% tariffs on any and all movies coming into our country. I mean, America imports movies all the time. It imports Australian movies. It imports movies made from countries all around the world. So, people are interpreting the statement as not necessarily a tax on all movies imported into the United States, even though it can be read like that, but most likely refers to those US movies that are being partly or wholly filmed overseas, but are kind of essentially American intellectual property. So the immediate question is, are tariffs the best mechanism to do this? And the answer is no. And as John knows well, tariffs are kind of import taxes, and they're for physical goods they're not for intellectual property, which movies are. And so it's, the tariffs are designed so if a good is coming in through a port, there's kind of an import tax on that product coming into the country. Whereas a movie, particularly this movie's being made overseas, it may be, half the movie's made in New Zealand, the other half's made in Australia, but the post-production happens in Canada. So, and all of this stuff is kind of being transferred, through broadband and through digital files and so on. So you can't impose tariffs on these movies. And also the other problem with the statement is any and all movies, and I discussed that bit about the importation of movies from around the world, but these companies are making all sorts of programs. It's unclear whether he's talking about movies for cinemas or movies for both cinemas and streaming platforms. And of course, he doesn't mention television series or television programs. So presumably, if a major Hollywood studio or streamers are making television series, presumably they're exempt from this tariff. And so taking the statement of the word any and all movies seems to suggest movies being made by the majors for cinemas, but potentially movies being made for streaming platforms. So that's a much narrower set of content that's being made by these companies. But because of his running feud with Hollywood, and because a lot of Hollywood stars have kind of backed the Democrats during the election process and so on, there was a sense that perhaps he is targeting the Hollywood majors in particular and movies being made for cinema release. And that's a very different market and a very different business scenario than the streaming platforms. The streaming platforms do make film and television programs, but the economics of streaming is very different to the economics of cinema and theatrical release. And of course, the decision to put a tariff was reconfirmed in September after the initial flagging that it may happen. And Trump has said that he will impose these tariffs. But again, there's been no further detail. And it's no clearer as to what these tariffs might look like. So the question is, and a lot of experts and commentators have been scrambling to kind of work out what this might mean. And a lot of it is speculation because there is no detail, and it is really based on the content of these truths. So, I mean, if you can't impose tariffs, what will you do? There could be some form of tax to punish companies, US companies that are making these movies outside the United States. There is a model in Europe where ticket sales are taxed. So if any of these companies make Godzilla, an example I'm going to give is Godzilla Kong. That entire franchise has been filmed here on the Gold Coast. But it's completely controlled by US companies. The IP is completely owned by US companies. By filming in Australia, they're taking advantage of all the government's tax offsets that are available. 30% tax offsets where they get a refundable amount, and then grants and all sorts of things. Now, potentially, there could be some type of tax on movies like that in terms of the revenue they make at the box office in terms of ticket sales. But of course, if that were to happen, the studios would just kind of pass the costs on to consumers, and the cost of cinema tickets would go up. There could be some type of sliding scale of taxes on companies making movies outside the United States. But again, it's really hard. If part of a movie's made, or if it's only the post-production of the movie is being made outside the United States, to what extent would they be penalized? How would you determine that? How would you enforce that? That's the other big question. And all of these questions are speculative, but what it would mean is presumably a contraction in the type of content being made. So depending on what is tariffed or what is taxed, the studios or the companies are likely to either steer away from that type of content. So if it is just movies, well, unfortunately, an outcome could be that they'll make less movies. And if it's movies for cinema, well, they'll make movies for streaming. If it's both cinema and streaming, they'll make less movies for both. And then television's already kind of overtaken cinema as the dominant way in which we watch screen content. So both the major studios and the streamers will just make more television. But what is also clear is that the costs will be passed on to consumers, whatever the outcome is. If streaming is taxed, subscriptions are likely to go up for our streaming services if it's a significant enough tax, and so on. So, I mean, the other thing that might be happening here is that Trump's announcement is a combination of policy and politics. So both statements have really had a kind of chilling effect on the industry. And it's no secret that he has running feuds with all sorts of Hollywood celebrities, and particularly those who've backed the Democrats in the elections. So there are thoughts that perhaps these announcements, even though they're kind of impractical, are kind of a shot across the bow to Hollywood to kind of say, look, you're on my radar. And the statements might be a way to kind of influence or impact the types of movies that they make, the content they make, but also the views that they are projecting through these movies. And kind of we've seen it with those late night TV hosts where Trump has very actively instructed his head of the communications authority or regulator to kind of rein in certain television stations because of TV personalities. So there may be something like that going on here, where he's kind of warning the Hollywood studios to kind of, take decisions that are more pro-Trump. And so maybe these statements are kind of doing that, because practically it's kind of almost impractical to tariff film or TV programs. But in terms of Australia, this has significant implications. So the amount of film and television production expenditure occurring in Australia each year is, obviously it's different each year, but, roughly 1.6 million, 1.8 million. And so in terms of the international film and television production that shoots in Australia, over the last, I think on average, last 5 years, it's been roughly 880 million per year. So it's quite a sizable amount of the total film and television expenditure happening here in Australia. And now movies account for about half of this figure. And so Aquaman, Godzilla, Kong, all these big Hollywood movies shooting on the Gold Coast or at Fox Studios in Sydney. So if the tariffs do come into play and Australia loses roughly 400 million of production expenditure, there's still a lot of film and TV production expenditure occurring, and that will have ramifications. There will be some job losses, but it's not devastating to the industry. If it does turn out that those tariffs end up being on everything, including television, well, that would be disastrous for Australia, because Australia is now a major player in this kind of global system of film and TV production. We have all these major film and television production facilities on the Gold Coast, Fox Studios in Disney Studios in Sydney, there's Melbourne Studios, there's South Australia Studios. We have a whole suite of government tax incentives that are there to entice international programs here. So if that production dries up because it's too expensive for American companies to send production to Australia, that would have massive implications for us. Losing, that proportion of the overall film and TV expenditure would result in lots and thousands of job losses. So that would be quite disastrous for us. One thing that's kind of come up is that the Australian government has recently released a long-awaited announcement on a 10% content quota on the streamers to compel them to make 10% of their overall expenditure spend on local content here in Australia. And it was a lot lower than what people hoped for, and a lot lower than what people thought would come out. The streamers are already making roughly, local content to an extent of about 10%. So it was a very timid a response from the government, and this policy had been delayed for a long period of time, and the government had said it is because of trade negotiations. So I do wonder if the government's very low level of 10% on local content quotas could be because they're keeping some powder dry for future negotiations if Trump does go ahead with 100% tariff on films, and that impacts the amount of films filming here in Australia. It could be part of future negotiations or a request for an exemption of those tariffs for movies filming in Australia, because the government could respond in kind with, okay, well, we'll increase the local content quota. Now, none of that has been kind of officially stated by the government, but it does seem like a logical kind of process for the government, and particularly because it is very closely tied with international trade. So it's a very fluid situation. It's very unclear. It's had a chilling effect of the industry. Lots of people, industry people I've talked to here, have said that production decisions have been frozen. Productions are not being greenlit to Australia as they have in the past because there is uncertainty around the tariffs. And if those tariffs do flow through, it would increase the costs of filming here enormously. So it's already had, quite a measurable impact, or a tangible impact. But I think, it's still got a way to go before we work out exactly what's happening here. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. A great link from the trade and geopolitical aspects that's coming in there as well. So we do have about 10 minutes for questions. So if you would like to put your questions into the Q&A, then we'll direct them to the panel. But just to get started, I guess, John, as you were wrapping up there, you were talking about how different countries were responding and what might be coming. So what do you think Australia's position should be?
Well, I mean, I might actually come straight back with a bit of a response to Mark on this, that historically, I mean, the US is a huge exporter of culture and movies and so forth. And so historically, the position in trade negotiations has been the US in support of completely free trade, and other countries, including Australia, supporting content quotas and things of that kind. And so while we could see it as a bargaining chip, I would say we could also see it as a potential benefit from this outcome, that if we lose GodzillaCon and get more picnic at Hanging Rocks, culturally, I think that's a very good trade. And that will be true, in my view, even if that meant less employment for people in the production business. I mean, in the end, a business is a business. We don't have a particular reason to favour employment of camera operators as opposed to nurses or other people we might choose to employ. The argument in the end has to be for the pictures at Hanging that this in some way supports the stuff we actually want in terms of culture. So that's, I suppose, an illustration of a general point that what we have to be doing is looking to work around the US in all sorts of contexts, and people are seeing this. The Ukrainians and Europeans are seeing it. Placate them as long as possible, but in the end, there's an abusive relationship we need to get out of. And in the trade context, I think that really suggests much more of a focus on our immediate region, Southeast Asia, India and so forth, trying to avoid our dependence on the US as a supplier and China as a market, trying to reduce those things and trying to focus on a world where those two countries are really seen as problems rather than drivers of what should be going on.
Thanks. Mark, did you want to respond?
I would just say a lot of people would agree with you, John. A lot of people were disappointed that it was only 10%. Screen Producers Association of Australia were arguing for 20%. A lot of academics were saying it should be tiered. So 30% to the large streamers. Like Netflix earned something like $1 billion, and they paid something ridiculous in taxes in Australia, like a very, like $10 million. It was very low. I can't remember the exact figure. But so a 10% reinvestment of that revenue in Australian content is a very small ask. So I think a lot of people would agree that, there should be more investment in local content. And if that's an outcome, I think a lot of people would be very happy in the industry and in, you know, criticism and scholarship and so on.
And consumers.
You go.
And consumers, presumably.
And consumers,
too, yeah.
you know, perhaps not initially, but over time.
Yeah.
I mean, because I mean, just sticking on the culture a little bit, I mean, one of the features of this is also, though, in some sense, a dehomogenisation of global culture. So we've had a globalised culture centred on the US, particularly, for example, in North America, people made no difference at all, whereas now Canadians are saying, we're going to watch Schitt's Creek and not a US competitor because it's Canadian, which was something that people really didn't think of at all until Trump came along.
Yeah, good point.
Karen, you talked about, that vacuum that gets created and the opportunities when the private sector still needs all of the things to go forward. Can you just expand on that a little bit about those opportunities for Australia?
So, with the exception of the US, the vast majority of the international system of states have signed up to trying to limit global average warming to 2 degrees, ideally keeping it close to 1.5 degrees. And the whole Paris Agreement is based around a structure that sees nationally determined commitments to deliver on that broader global objective. We have a target of 62 to 70% reduction on 2005 levels by 2035, just as an example. And in order for us to meet that target, we're going to need to see, frankly, a doubling of effort by the government, but also the private sector, to be able to reduce those emissions by that amount. So what that means is that even though the United States has left the party, there is still a series of national commitments that have been made that need to be delivered on. And in order for them to be delivered on, you need to have the environmental goods and services available across supply chains and jurisdictions in order to be able to reduce emissions, pursue low carbon opportunities and the like. Not all countries are built the same. And, to go back to John's sort of early part of his talk around comparative advantage and the multilateral rules system, etc., we tend to play where we have a comparative advantage. What that means for Australia is that we have the advantage of being able to, if we want to, export many of the commodities that we have always exported, but doing them in a way that meets green, clean credentials, because they would be produced and manufactured off the back of renewable energy, if you look at an emissions profile, or that have green credentials with respect to minimizing the impact of nature. So we are in a really nice position, and this is Ross Garnaut and others thinking, to be able to pivot Australia as being still a small exporting, trade exposed nation, but one that can now deliver on those goods and services that require clean and green credentials, so that other countries can meet their climate ambitions, which they've signed up to and have maintained their commitments to despite the last 10 or 12 months or so. Now that requires a couple of things happening. One is that we have confidence now and ongoing that the international system of trading nations is going to maintain their aspirations vis-a-vis net zero. And secondly, that the Australian government and the private sector is going to continue on a trajectory that sees the shift of emissions intensity in the grid, for example, so that if you are producing aluminium, you're able to say you did it in a way that was greener than it would have been otherwise. So the opportunity is there. The settings arguably are there at the moment, although there need to be a leaning in over the coming 10 years if that's to be realized at scale.
Thank you. Time's gone very quickly because we've covered such a wide range of topics today, but I'd like to really thank John, Mark and Karen for your presentations, and I'm sure the discussions will continue. This is an initiative between the Centre for Data Science and the Queensland Academy of Arts and Sciences. So I'd also like to thank Ashley Stewart and Becky Cook and the team at the Centre for Data Science who have helped put on the seminar today, but also all of the seminars throughout the year. and also Emeritus Professor Roland Sussex and Professor Kerry Mengerson, Distinguished Professor Kerry Mengerson, whose initiative started this collaboration and have continued to date. So thank you all for joining us today or for watching later on, and I wish you all the best for the season coming up. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.